Good morning, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session of Rumination with Andrew. And thank you for joining. And I hope that you will have a stimulating time as you spend time with me as we are about to discuss a very important topical matter. And this morning, we are going to talk about, let me see here, because I have to make sure that I have the correct phrase, the ADOS or ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery. Now, American Descendants of Slavery, it has been a new terminology in the Black community in the United States. There are African Americans who argue that there are lots of immigrant Black people from the Caribbean and from Africa and from all over the African diaspora, I should say, that who have journeyed rather to America. And they are actually eclipsing the opportunities that were supposed to be given to descendants, right? Those who are, let me say it again, those who are ADOS, which they are American descendants of slavery. So they're arguing that there are people who, there are Black people rather, in the diaspora who went to the United States and as slaves, and they lived there for centuries, and they are the descendants of these slaves. And that for that reason, they do not understand, particularly after the decades of the 1960s, as you had more immigrants, going into the United States, immigrating to the United States, and bringing their cultural artifacts and their cultural customs and norms with them. They think that it is unfair that these people who are not direct descendants of slaves from America should be entering and should be accelerating in terms of the progress that they're making, economic progress, education progress, just progress in all spheres of society. These American descendants, I always forget the name, American descendants of slavery, ADOS, believe that they are being slighted and that these so-called other Black people who are not direct American descendants of slavery are actually reaping the benefits of what these American descendants of slavery have fought for. Now, that is an interesting sort of perspective, because in the first place, we must understand that America is an immigrant country, and people have been immigrating from all over, from Europe, from Asia, and from the African continent. We do know that slavery tainted that level of immigration, and people who are deemed to be Blacks or described as Blacks are considered to be people who are direct descendants of slavery. That slavery had a past here, means that we are descendants of slaves. Now, in the Caribbean region, the slave trade existed. And I just wanted to clarify some facts here because sometimes we tend to, reason based on errors, right? Things that do not have any basis in facts, all right, or truth. Now, so we have here, let me share this with you from the Conversation newspaper. Just wanted to highlight something here from the Conversation newspaper to clarify some data, some historical facts. So we have here, the Conversation is a newspaper. It says American slavery separating fact from myth, because a lot of what we believe sometimes are mythical, and I do not blame people for believing them sometimes because our institutions or academic institutions a lot of times have politicized education. And we know that history, what you learn, the narratives that you learn of history depends on whether you are on the right or on the political left. And that should not be. We should be aiming toward guarantee people and giving them the truth, right? Empowering them with truth and the correct understanding of what history is all about. But the article here was published in 2017. It said, people think they know everything about slavery in the United States, but they don't. They think the majority of African slaves came to the American colonies, but they didn't. They talk about 400 years of slavery, but it wasn't. They claim all Southerners owned slaves, but they didn't. Some argue it was all a long time ago, but it wasn't. So that was a very interesting introduction, right? Opening to this article. So listen to what this author is saying. Slavery has been in the news a lot lately, from the discovery of the auction of 272 enslaved people that enabled Georgetown University to remain in operation, to the McGraw-Hill textbook controversy over calling slaves workers from Africa, and the slavery memorial being built at the University of Virginia. Americans are having conversations about this difficult period in American history. Some of these dialogues have been wrought with controversy and conflict, like the University of Tennessee student who challenged her professor's understanding of enslaved families. Now, the author went in to talk about some of the myths and some of the truths, and we need to correct some of these myths that we have had, that we have been, indoctrinated into believing. Now, so we have 4 myths about slavery, and myth number 1, the majority of African captives came to what became the United States. Many people think that the descendants of slaves in America, that many of these slaves came directly from Africa. They did not. Many of them came from the Caribbean and, other parts of the world, but particularly the Caribbean region, right? Jamaica, Barbados, right? You remember now that the British were the ones who, for the most part, controlled the slave trade, which they actually ended around about 1808. And the United States, when you think about the United States came on the scene or just began to rise round about the latter part of or the mid part of the 18th century, the early part, probably 1820s and onward, right? Or 1830s, we could say. So the United States was not a global power at that time when the slave trade was at its height. The British and the French, but primarily the British, because the British also, the United States was also once a colony of Great Britain. So if, since the United States had been practicing slavery from 1619 and thereon. Now, remember now that the slavery that was practiced in 1619 up to round about 1820 and thereabout was not as organized. Let us say that. It wasn't as organized and brutal as what came after 1820, when the United States organized its economy around slavery for the most part. Okay, now the truth, only a little more than 300,000 captives, or 4 to 6%, came to the United States. So the United States had a very minute portion of slaves that came directly from Africa. Now, one of the things that Professor Orlando Patterson, who is a historical sociologist at Harvard University, and who is also Jamaican, by the way, he argued in his book, Slavery and Social Death, I should say, Slavery and Social Death, not death, but Slavery and Social Death. We should go and buy that book, that Jamaica had the worst system of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. I found that very hard to believe, but what he said is that the slaves were never able to reproduce. The British worked them so hard, and they just said, okay, collateral damage, they die when they die, right? And so they overworked them, and they died at disproportionate rates, and then they would have to always import other slaves from Africa. Unlike the US, even though the US system, now we're not suggesting here that the US system was not brutal, but the United States system, the Blacks there were allowed to procreate. So the system was able to continue with Americans or African Americans procreating at a rapid pace. And that was something that was interesting. So a lot of the times when Americans say that a lot of what the defects of African Americans, or the defects that are found in the African American community, that it is related to Africa, it is not. And I have always corrected many that whatever defects Black Americans have is holistically American. All of the defects are cultural, all of the cultural defects are American defects, defects that they have garnered there, that they have picked up in America and not in Africa, because very few of the people there were directly transported from Africa, all right? A significant number of enslaved Africans arrived in the American colonies by way of the Caribbean. So the Caribbean region has always been the center of slavery. And I always also say, that it's also the center of freedom. Because when we think about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, without that revolution, many of the other Caribbean nations and countries in Latin America and the United States itself would not have considered slavery as defeatable, as as an institution that could have been defeated. The Haitians gave all other Blacks in the Americas the possibility that they could overcome their masters. Now, where they were seasoned and mentored into slave life. So that has been going on for a long time. For those of you who think that you are, again, American descendants of slavery, you must understand that a lot of times that your descendants came from Africa through the Caribbean, vis-a-vis the Caribbean. Very few of them actually landed directly from Africa in the United States. And it's something that we need to be clear on, right? Because I think that for some reason, these errors are dividing our community. And when we think about so-called white people, for example, we know that whites, what you call whites, because nobody's really white. Nobody is white. But that is what they've taught us, and you understand what I mean. But Europeans have never been united. We know that, when many of them went to the United States, you had the WASP, who thought that they were superior to other Eastern Europeans and those who were coming from southern parts of Europe, like the Italians, right? All of these people they thought were inferior. In fact, some of them thought that the Italians were more niggardly, as some of them would say, than Black people themselves. And they were ostracized and treated very badly. The Irish also were not treated well when they went to the United States. However, because of the fact that the elites look more like the ordinary European and they wanted to keep the power in their hands, they had to allow these people to come on their sides. So eventually they gave the Italians more rights than they would have given to a typical African American and the Irish and other white people. Now, African Americans are arguing also that people from the Caribbean and from Africa are getting more rights than they. But I don't think so. I don't think that it's that they're getting more rights. I think they come there with a different purpose and with a different attitude in terms of how they want to grow. And because they're coming from economies and from, cultures that might not have been developed as America has developed its culture and its economic base, they come there with that deep desire to improve on their lives. And I think that to some extent, African Americans do not have that hunger as they have it in them to succeed. If you also want to succeed, you can succeed. Because when you look at what happened after the Civil War in the United States and to see how many people read the book, the Black, that book by, what's his name again? Wow, the Black Reconstruction, right? If you read Black Reconstruction by W.A.E. Du Bois, then you are going to see how after the Civil War, how many African Americans who were slaves, right? So these freed slaves, okay, they went and they educated themselves, they learned to read and to write, and they became congressmen and congresswomen. They were very, very, what should I say now, motivated to upward social mobility. I understand, however, based on the history, that during the period of Reconstruction and the fact that African Americans were progressing at an alarming rate, that so-called Euro-Americans became very jealous. And they started to implement very rigid laws and started to burn down people's African American businesses and to demotivate them from studying, trying to put barricades when African Americans wanted to succeed. So because of years of segregation and terrorism in the United States, domestic terrorism by white people toward Black people, I think that a lot of times after perhaps post the 1960s, that African Americans became very tired. And when the whole system of desegregation and integration came about, it seems to me by that time, either the population, two things happened. African Americans they were very tired, they were exhausted at all the years of continuous harassment and terrorism, meted out to them by their white counterparts. And also the fact is that they thought that because the integration was now implemented, that they had equal rights. I think that African Americans need to understand that integration did not mean equal rights. And if we understand what Marcus Garvey said, that once you have a situation where blacks and whites have to live together on the same soil, they will never be equal, that whites will never grant them that equal status of humanity. And he is correct. We are proving him correct now, that integration did not mean that so-called white Americans wanted you to have a similar status and economic equality with them. It was not meant to be that way. And I think that African Americans have to understand that. But it's not that Africans who are coming from the continent or Caribbean blacks are in any way, better than African Americans. It's not that they have more ability, academic ability and other, skills than African Americans do. The fact of the matter is that they are coming from economies, from a sociocultural dynamic in which they also have been empowered. They are not coming as feeling as if they have to subsume themselves. They have to, what should I say now, be submissive to a white, so-called white culture, because that is not how the mindset was, sort of acculturated back there in Africa and in the Caribbean, where you have predominantly people of predominantly Black communities, what you call Black communities. And I don't think that, Caribbean people and African people view themselves in racial terminologies as American blacks do, because you were forced to do that because America created that rigid racial line that you had to consider yourselves as being Black or white or Hispanic or Asian, whatever it is. But people who live in normal societies, because as far as racial dynamics are concerned, America is an abnormal society. It is abnormal and childish at best, right? People should not grow up to think about their racial identity. It should be about your human character, the development of the human potential. That is what humanity is all about. And then you can talk about your nationality. Then you can talk about your ethnic group, your religious group. But you should not first identify with any racial group, because that doesn't make any sense. Because people are not a monolith. The African continent is not a monolithic culture, as people know by now, right? It's a continent of different countries, and they have their different cultural practices and habits and worldviews, religions, etc., etc. And so the same thing happens in America. You can't just say Black people. Who are Black people, and what do you think they are, and how do you think they should behave? And there's some foolish American whites who believe that, all Black people behave the same way or should behave the same way. And then when they're speaking to them, they have that attitude. And when they don't behave the way in which they think they should behave, then they become befuddled and they are confused. They don't know how to deal with the people because they have been indoctrinated into believing that Blacks are this and Blacks are that. But there's no monolithic Black culture in any part of the world. In the same way, there is no monolithic white culture. Those are subjective terminologies that have been crafted by the American elites and the European elites to control populations, and so that the populations would not unite against the elites and take away their power. So you have to understand that. Myth two, slavery lasted for 400 years. And this is saying popular culture is rich with references to 400 years of oppression. There seems to be confusion between the transatlantic slave trade that happened from 1440 to 1888 and the institution of slavery, confusion only reinforced by the Bible, right? And the time when the Jews spent over 400 years in um in Egypt. Now, the slaves in America and around the world, but particularly in the United States, they actually had that analogy. They made the analogy between the Israelites, the Jews, what happened to them in Egypt, and what took place during the transatlantic slave trade. And when, after the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1863, well, it wasn't after, it was still during, but the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, the slaves really sang. They sang the song of Moses and the Lamb, an equivalent of that song, and they were very happy that they had been freed and behaved similarly to how the Jews, when they were in Egypt and after God had freed them, had liberated them with his strong arm. Now, we have here, slavery was not unique to the United States. It's a part of almost every nation's history, from Greek and Roman civilizations to contemporary forms of human trafficking. The American part of the story lasted fewer than 400 years, right? So it's much smaller. It's not 400 years that it lasted for. How then do we calculate the timeline of slavery in America? Most historians use 1619 as a starting point. 20 Africans referred to as servants arrived in Jamestown, Virginia on a Dutch ship. It's important to note, however, that they were not the first Africans on American soil. Africans first arrived in America in the late 16th century, not as slaves, but as explorers, together with Spanish and Portuguese explorers, right? Because Africans had skills that the Europeans didn't have, and they were versed, as you know, they're coming from the culture of the Moors in mathematics, astronomy, and other areas that you think they were not exposed to, because we have been given this false history of Africa, that Africa was this backward place and the Europeans went there and civilized them. But we must understand that Europe, to a large extent, during the transatlantic slave trade that started round about, the 15th century, were very, very uncivilized countries, very backward countries. And they used slavery as a manner of uplifting the continent of Europe. Now, number three, the next myth is that all Southerners owned slaves, right? And roughly 25% of all the Southerners owned slaves. I didn't want to get into that, but I just wanted to look at the whole concept of the American descendants of slaves, because I'm saying that you have to be careful with that, because many African Americans are descendants of Caribbean and African immigrants, a lot, including the famous Malcolm X. And Marcus Garvey was Jamaican, full Jamaican, went to the United States, and he revolutionized the history of Black the Black American history, as far as we know. And even the Nation of Islam, they were Garveyites, and lots of other, the civil rights movement, as Dr. Martin Luther King suggested and declared, that had it not been for Marcus Garvey, there perhaps would not have been the second, I would call it the second phase of the civil rights movement, because the first phase of the civil rights movement started during the period of Reconstruction, right? During 1865 to 1877. So that is something that we need to understand, that there are two civil rights movements in the United States. The first phase started during the Reconstruction that began in 1865, 1866, some people say 1866 to 1877, when the North and the South, the elites collaborated and they worked against working people and also the liberties of Black people more specifically. One of the things that we have to understand is that if we are going to talk about the American descendants of slavery, it's almost like we're suggesting that there are some pure Black people in America, and they came directly from Africa and they have been living in the United States for centuries. But if you probably look back at your history, you'd be surprised that many of your ancestors, that's African-American history, would have come from Jamaica, from Barbados, among other countries in the Caribbean. So we have to be careful of suggesting that they are direct descendants of slavery. It does not add up because America is, as we have said, an immigrant country. One of the founding fathers, I think it was Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, am I correct? Or I think he actually was born in Grenada, right? So, and if probably check other white people who, so-called white Europeans who have lived in the United States, could go back to the Caribbean because the Caribbean was connected to the colonies of the United States because, the United States was once a colony of Great Britain. So it's very, very difficult for Black Americans to truthfully say that they are direct descendants of slavery or of people who came from Africa, because very few of you actually, your ancestors, very few of your ancestors, Black American ancestors, came directly from Africa. So that is something that you've got to think about or to rethink about, because I think that it's another method to disunite and to create divisions among Black peoples. And we've got to be very, very careful about being divided, because right now, the African Americans, Black Americans, you cannot work on your own. Even this whole notion of reparations, who is ahead of it? The Caribbean. What's his name? Beckles at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, the Barbadian Hilary Beckles. He is the one who is at the helm of this reparation movement. So you cannot really work on your own. If we want to empower ourselves, and that's why Marcus Garvey went to the United States, even though he was an American, but he was able to connect, even though we are hearing from this Professor Hill, a Jamaican professor at the University of, I think he's now Professor Emeritus at the University of California, that the Marcus Garvey movement in the United States was predominantly Caribbean, was predominantly West Indian. Be as it may, we understand that many African Americans were also a part of it, joined it because they were stimulated, and they received some form of inspiration from that movement, from the Garvey movement. Now, this is, I had put up here Statista. Yeah, this is Statista, and they were giving us some data in terms of the number of slaves which came to the Americas. And we have here in Portugal, we had over 3 million, UK over 3 million, France, over 1 million, and Netherlands, okay, we have just 596,862, and Spain 568,654. In the United States, we only had 377,613. So not a lot of slaves were brought directly from Africa. Now, when we talked about Portugal here, we mean that they shipped them there and then en route to the Caribbean region, right? And the countries most active in the transatlantic slave trade, number of enslaved Africans forced to embark on ships of the following national flags. So this is what they were sent to Europe, then they on their way en route to the Caribbean. So the Caribbean region is a very important region for African Americans to study. When you also look at Charleston in South Carolina, it's also, many of the people there are descendants of Barbados, right? Because, Barbados had a situation in which, many of the slaves were sent there to work from Barbados to Charleston. So that is something that you need to be aware of, those who think themselves to be American descendants of slavery, because it is far more nuanced. The history is far more nuanced and complex than you can imagine. And as I've said before, now is not the time for African Americans and Caribbean Blacks or Africans who live on the continent to be disunited. We have already been disunited, and even Caribbean Blacks, do not live in harmony either. We have this constant division amongst us, and who's better and which island is better than the other, and which the British preferred over the other. For example, Barbados is known as Little England. It's known to be the preferred island of all the Caribbean region. Jamaica was the region where the in which the British extracted most of its profit in terms of the overworking of the slaves. But, they preferred to have settled in Barbados because Barbados is a flatter island to Jamaica. It's a flat island, while Jamaica is mountainous. So you had lots of slave rebellions on the island. And they suggested that, well, at least Orlando Patterson has suggested that the topography of Jamaica, whatever it was on the island, but many of the slave masters died when they went there. So they preferred not to stay in Jamaica, not to live, not to settle in Jamaica, but a lot of them settled either in Barbados or they went back to the States or back to England. All right, so Jamaica was predominantly an absentee plantation economy, and to some extent, it is still that way now. Where the Jamaican elites, they also have expatriated their wealth and their economic capital to other tax havens outside of Jamaica because their purpose is not to build the infrastructure of Jamaica, but it's just to use Jamaica as as a platform for acquiring obscene profits as what the British did. So our, Black people or whatever you call them are just, they have just replaced the British overlords, particularly in Jamaica. I'm not talking about Barbados now because Barbados have always been that settler nation state. So the British, quite a bit of the British people lived there and lived harmoniously with the descendants of slaves. So very important. Now, this is coming from Henry Louis Gates, right? And he Jr., he is a Harvard professor, could have retired now, not sure if he's still there, but he is a professor of African American studies. So he should know, and he is also at one of the world's leading universities, Harvard University. He says, how many slaves landed in the United States? That's a question that he's asking. I think he perhaps did a PBS documentary on that. And he suggests here, perhaps you like me were raised essentially to think of the slave experience primarily in terms of our Black ancestors here in the United States. And that's why we have to be careful when we just, look at our small geographic location and think that this is what happened. When you read, for example, Black Reconstruction by W.E. Du Bois, then he gives you a very wide, perspective about, the history of the American slave trade, that's the US slave trade, and how much it helped to build countries like Western Europe in France and these companies, these French companies, these British companies, these Dutch companies were working together with US elites, with the US Southerners, and they were being enriched. So it's not just like, you have the British slave trade and you have the American slave trade and you have the Dutch slave trade. When you look at it very carefully, they were competitors, don't get me wrong. They were competitors and they were aggressive competitors also. However, they united when they needed to have united and benefited economically from this unity of purpose at some time. So they fought, as we have seen our global powers now fighting, but sometimes, especially when it comes on to us, the ordinary people, they unite against us to inflict dangers and harms upon us, right? And the Southerners, even though the US and the British perhaps were so-called enemies because the Americans had separated from the British Empire. However, when it came on to economics, they united against, any slave rebellion, any sort of movement that wanted to repress slavery and to demolish it as an institution. Now, so he's suggesting here, in other words, slavery was primarily about us, right? From Crispus Attucks and Attucks, right? Crispus Attucks and Phyllis Wheatley, Benjamin Banneker, and Richard Allen, all the way to Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass. So these are the prominent African-American slaves or former slaves. Think of this as an instance of what we might think of as African-American exceptionalism. In other words, If it's in the Black experience, it's got to be about Black Americans. Well, think again. That's what Lewis is saying, is suggesting here. The most comprehensive analysis of shipping records over the course of the slave trade is a transatlantic slave trade database, edited by Professors David Ellis and David Richardson. While the editors are careful to say that all of their figures are estimates, I believe they are the best estimates that we have, the proverbial gold standard in the field of the study of the slave trade. Between 1525 and 1866, in the entire history of the slave trade to the New World, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. 10.7 million survived the dreaded Middle Passage, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. And we know that Brazil got the most of the slaves, followed by the Caribbean. And how many of these 10.7 million Africans were shipped directly to North America? That's the United States. Only about 388,000. So you can call African Americans, as they are often called, Americans, and which they are, without even knowing this data. They are Americans, right? Because that's where they were born. So they're not African Americans, as they are suggesting. Yes, you can say that their descendants are coming from Africa, but culturally, they are Americans, because very few slaves were transported directly from Africa to the United States. If the descendants of slaves in Brazil, right? If the descendants of slaves in Brazil are called Brazilians, why aren't you calling African Americans Americans? Right? You can see that this was rigid indoctrination in which the predominantly European population decided that they didn't want African Americans to be bona fide nationals of the country, and they gave them these titles of becoming Blacks and African Americans, and this is the way how you should behave, and they would never be able to prosper and to be equal to their European counterparts or the descendants of European people. Something fascinating. And now what the American elites are doing, they are trying now to divide and conquer Black people who are coming from other parts of the world, such as the Caribbean and Africa. But as far as we're concerned, we're all united. We're not all equal, because we'll never be equal. We don't have equal cultures, right? The Jamaican is not equal to Barbados. Barbados is not equal to Jamaica. We're all different people coming from different nation states. We have different values, different levels of education, different awareness of the world in which we live, etc., etc., etc. But what we need to understand is that if we're going to fight against tyranny, if we're going to fight against the discrimination or against people of our skin pigmentation, then we have to unite, and we cannot, be divided at this juncture of the history. And this thing about African descendants of, American descendants of slavery is something that I think is erroneous, and something that African Americans need to think about, because this ideology, this philosophy, is going to destroy the Black community. And it is not rooted also in historical facts, because I'm saying even W.E. Du Bois, a very, very prominent African-American scholar and civil rights activist, he is of Haitian descent. And I saw this podcast of this young man who was talking about the fact, he was speaking about the fact that Barack Obama has failed the Black community. But the Black community should have understood when Barack Obama came to office in 2008 that he was going to be the president of the United States. He was not going to be the president of Black or white or Hispanic people. Some people said that he did more for gays, more for transgendered people, and more for white than he did for Blacks, right? The fact of the matter is that we understand that we are living in a world. The United States is functioning in a world in which it is built on those values of racism. It's sad. I mean, the Constitution is not built on that, but the cultural practice, culturally, the United States is built on racism, right? It's built on that racial hierarchy, and it is a very rigid one and very difficult for people of my hue to really elevate themselves and to have social upward mobility or upward social mobility, I should say. So I just wanted to point out that because I think that there is a lot of ignorance as far as that is concerned. And perhaps I should do a video one of these days on prominent African Americans of foreign descent whose ancestors had, came from different countries, because, as the podcaster was suggesting, Kamala Harris, she is Vice President of the United States, and Barack Obama, who was the president, and he emphasized that he was Kenyan, he was not American, he was an African American. Now, how can you say that? If he was born in Hawaii, he was born to African parent, or African father, and a European American mother. How can you suggest that he is Kenyan? Yes, he has Kenyan roots, right? But he's not Kenyan, right? To be Kenyan would mean that he was born in Kenya, and he's culturally a Kenyan. And what's his name? Barack Obama, by no stretch of the imagination, behaves like a Kenyan. I doubt he speaks any Swahili. Maybe he does, I don't know. Maybe he speaks a few words, but all of his gestures and gesticulations and his movement and his, body language, depict an American citizen, right? He is a full-fledged American citizen. He was born in Hawaii. Now, you might argue that, perhaps you should, if we want to have a Black president, why not, couldn't they have not chosen a full-fledged Black person who was not mixed? You probably could argue that. I'm not going to argue that. But the whole point of the matter is that in the United States, they're saying that if you have this one drop, sort of situation, just a little tiny bit of Black in your blood, according to what they say, which is idiotic. You are Black, but as we've said before, 90% of the people in the South, the people who deem themselves to be white, are Black, or they have Black blood in them. So that is a fact, and that was done by a British geneticist who went to the United States, lived there in the southern part of the United States, and lived there and did his research as a geneticist, and he was able to come to the conclusion that over 90% of Southern whites have Black blood, and vice versa, and Blacks having white blood, or European blood, if you will. So we have to be careful about dividing people and putting people into boxes and think that they should be there. Whether the person is Haitian in terms of their ancestral background, I don't think it should matter. It represents a person who is of African descent, and we should be proud of that person. I understand, however, that there are some who are not, in terms of the policies that they advocate, are against people of African descent, and we can look carefully at their policies. Let's not look at their skin color, but as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. says, let's look at the content of their characters. And in the case of the politicians, whether it's Barack Obama or Kamala Harris, or it is Karine Jean-Pierre, let's look at their policies and who are they siding with? Are they siding with the global elites, or are they defending the interests of the common, ordinary American people? If they're doing that, then we should give them props, not to just look at their skin color and if they're biracial and all the sort of nonsense that the US has made up to describe people, right? But I do not think that the whole idea that they're American descendants of slavery, the ADOS people who think that they're ADOS. I think that is a myth, and that you are just another person who is a descendant. All right, all of us in the diaspora are descendants of slavery. All of us, right, in that African um, diaspora, right? Not only African Americans. So I think it is time for us to get rid of these divisionary lines and begin to look at more substantive matters that afflict Black people and the policies that might be working against us. Because let me just end this video here by saying that there could be people, let us say that Barack Obama had no sort of European ancestral lineage in his, in his DNA, right? It doesn't mean that he would have worked on our behalf. He could be black as Marcus Garvey, and as with all the African features. It does not mean that he would have represented the interest of all African Americans. Or let us say that he was even, according to these people, an American descendants of slavery, an ADOS. He belonged to the ADOS community. It didn't mean that he had to also represent their interest, because all Black people are not, the same, and they have their different interests. They are individuals, and they have their different agendas: political agenda, religious agenda, economic agenda. All agendas people have, and they hold, no matter the color of their skin. We have to look at how they have been acculturated, where they have been educated, and what forms of indoctrination they might have acquired. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that I was able to articulate something that made sense, because I was, watching this video yesterday, and when I heard this ADOS, I was like, what's this ADOS thing? I had heard it before, but when he was using the acronym, I was saying I couldn't understand this American descendants of slavery. And he eventually he said it in the middle of this program that the ADOS referred to American descendants of slavery. And I thought, what nonsense, because I understand the history very well, that many of the African Americans who are descendants of slavery, their ancestors did not journey directly from slavery to America, but they journeyed, vis-a-vis Europe and the Caribbean. So it's time for African Americans to educate themselves about their own history. And also, many of you go to the Caribbean. Don't just go there for tourism and walk around and behave as if you are somebody special, but you need to study your own history and the history of the Caribbean, and see how these two histories are interrelated, because you might learn a lot than you can imagine. Thank you so much for joining, and please be sure to subscribe and to leave a comment and to like the videos, so that the algorithms can be triggered, and for the videos to be shared to people all around the world. Thank you so much for joining. All the best to you. Bye.